Welcome back, everybody, to a crossover event between the Junkyard Dogcast and the Auburn Undercover podcast. I'm the Junkyard Dogcast host, Jordan Hill. We've got Auburn Undercover's Nathan King with us on this Thursday afternoon in Athens, Thursday morning in Auburn, getting ready for this year's edition of the Deep South's oldest rivalry. So getting ready, a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss with Nathan. And I'll throw it to you, Nathan. How is this Thursday morning on the plains treating you as we get ready for another edition of this rivalry game?
It is going great, Jordan. As you know, my wife works at the hospital, and one of her patients gave her like a brunch set. So like all you have to do is kind of like mix the stuff in. Very satisfactory, I would say. Since I'm not a very good cook, it's turned out to be pretty good. Yeah, I'm very excited for you to be back in town this weekend. It was funny on our message board this morning, posting your Q&A story. Someone was like, "Why do I recognize that name?" Has Jordan Hill ever been in Auburn? I was like, he has, actually. So you know this rivalry better than most people. But yeah, Jordan, I'm really interested to get your side of things. Of course, on the Bulldogs, we did this last year. If everybody remembers, both of our sides of the podcast listeners. So this will not be, if you're an Auburn listener, this will not be a standard Q&A Georgia person tells you everything. If you're a Georgia listener, this will not be that for the Auburn side. It'll kind of be me and Jordan playing both sides here, just because a lot of times when we do this crossover stuff, you'll do like two separate episodes, and me and Jordan just kind of figure, that's kind of a waste of time. It's a waste of 30 or 40 minutes. So we'll just pack it all in here. But you guys seem to enjoy it last year, and yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Definitely, and I will say, and Nathan, you can give your perspective, but I always sort of feel bad when I have those beat writers on talking, because I speak for like 4 minutes, and then I'm like, okay, you carry 23 minutes or whatever of the podcast. So it's always fun, and I think it works well in a game like this with a rivalry where, like you mentioned, Nathan, I've been there in Auburn. I sort of know that perspective, but also, people have paid attention to what's going on at Georgia. Even over there on the plains, that they've seen what is going on, and there's a lot of intrigue in this year's game, and a lot of questions, I think, for both sides.
Yeah, it's one would think, and I think there's probably not a ton of Auburn fans who necessarily think their team is going to go out there and get a win on Saturday, but the formula is in place because it's in Jordan-Hare, and that's what Hugh Freeze said on Monday. He said, "Thank God this game is in Jordan-Hare Stadium." Because these things happen sometimes, and you don't have to go. It's 2 decades. It's a little while back, but that's not as far as some teams. Maybe the last time Auburn beat a number 1 team as an unranked team. Florida came in here in 2001 as a 21-point favorite in that game, and Auburn won in the late stages. And so it would take, as we're going to get into the factors that it would take here, but I understand Georgia is playing extremely well at the beginning of the season, but it has some injuries. I know that some things maybe have not been up to par of what they thought. Auburn obviously has a ton of issues offensively, but Auburn's defense has been pretty solid here in the early season. You'd like to see a bounce back performance from the quarterbacks. Is Georgia the right team to remedy that? I don't know. It's pretty good defense to try to fix some of your issues against. But yeah, I mean, we've seen enough of these games to where, I mean, there was the game a couple years ago when Brian Harsin was here, Stetson Bennett, and I think Ladd McConkey had a touchdown in that game. And that one was pretty uncompetitive. Every other Georgia Auburn game I've seen in this stadium has been pretty competitive over the years. So maybe this one has an opportunity to be the same.
Definitely. I think the last one with Gus and those guys in 19, Bo led a second half comeback. Didn't quite, get the job done to beat Georgia, but it was a very competitive game. I figure we kind of go back and forth talking about these two teams, and I'll start with you, Nathan, with Auburn. First loss of the season last week at Texas A&M. What's just sort of the vibe you've gotten about where this team is right now? 3-1, getting ready for this big game. And just what the coaches have been saying, getting ready for Georgia versus Auburn.
Yeah, well, the biggest thing here in the early season has been the passing game. And that's not something, if you are Auburn moving forward, you want to see out of a team that hired Hugh Freeze. Obviously, that's been his strong suit over the years, regardless of where he's been, has been not only his quarterback development, but his ability to have a successful passing game. And so that was what reared up mostly against Texas A&M. Obviously, it was their first loss of the season, and so this is by no means doom and gloom for Auburn because, like you said, they are 3-1. I mean, it's the early part of the year, and they only have one loss, and it was in a game that they're about a touchdown underdog, so it's not like a lot of people expected them to go in there and win. But I will say, Auburn's played 2 Power 5 games here early in the year, and the passing game has looked pretty bad in both of them. They were very lucky to go on the road and beat Cal. That game really showed that one drive is all it takes because Auburn was extremely inconsistent, lots of turnovers. Peyton Thorne really wasn't able to get into a rhythm in that game, but he leads a 70-yard drive with 6 minutes left, and that was all it took because your defense played well against Texas A&M, and that's where a lot of my concerns come in with this Georgia game for Auburn is that this is an offensive line that just got overwhelmed, and it was a quarterback who never necessarily looked comfortable in this game. Career low in completions for Peyton Thorne, only 6 of them. Career low in yards. He only threw for 44 yards. It's never a great number for your starting quarterback. And he was benched in the third quarter. It was a hard benching. Like they only went back to him later in the game because they didn't trust Robbie Ashford to make throws on 3rd and long. And so if you're a Georgia fan, I would still expect Peyton Thorne to be the starter in this game. Everything we've heard from Hugh Freeze being at practice, it seems pretty likely that he's going to continue to be the starting quarterback. Heading into the bye week, though, they've also got some issues maybe with the play calling right now. Hugh Freeze has admitted, this is tough for me. I've never done this before. I've never handed over play calling before. And it's been, it's been shaky. It's been so-so. And that's got to be tough for an offensive coach to kind of be hands off on that. And so I just think with this being a year one, you've got nothing to lose. I mean, you're already in a better spot than you thought you were going to be in terms of a roster. Like this was not a roster that should have gone to a bowl game, and then Freeze got here and flipped it through the transfer portal. So you're starting to see, I think, through one SEC game where you're facing a really talented defense at Texas A&M, you're seeing, hey, here are some of the cracks in the armor that come with a patchwork roster. Because at the end of the day, like there are exciting pieces all over this team, and a bunch of the defensive pieces have come together really, really well. It's still a bunch of guys coming together from group of 5 schools. It's still a bunch of guys playing together for the first time in their careers. All that being said, I would be surprised if Auburn is not better this week against Georgia. It was just so out of sync offensively against Texas A&M. It never seemed like Peyton Thorne was very comfortable. He's not necessarily the pocket presence was a big thing. I mean, if anyone watched that game, 5 sacks and few of them were on the offensive line, but a few of them were on him. He didn't have the best ability to necessarily read edge pressure. And so, again, Georgia's NFL talent on defense is not the correct remedy, I think, for those issues. But at the same time, this is a coaching staff you have to give the benefit of the doubt to and have to say, hey, they're going to do a good job of adjusting. If they don't, they've got the bye week to do it. But, we talked about it a little bit in our Q&A on our site here on Thursday, Jordan, but I am interested to see, because everything I've kind of gathered from you, that this is not the same Georgia defensive line of the past couple years. It's really good, and I think it's got some NFL players. I know they've got some injuries right now. I guess I'm most interested in your perspective of that part of the game, that matchup of what they can do to maybe overwhelm the offensive line and Auburn's passing game and just kind of throw it out of whack, because I think that's where this game starts and ends. If Auburn can't do anything in that part of the game again, I don't really think they have a chance to compete.
I think it's probably the matchup to watch in this game, especially to your point, Nathan, if Auburn is going to make this a 4-quarter game. I've been a little underwhelmed by this defensive line. Now, part of it is the competition. You'd think when you're playing a UT Martin, a Ball State, a UAB, that you should just dominate. And there's been moments, but but it has not been what I would imagine that would have happened. Now, part of the problem in the last week, Michael Williams, defensive end, guy that I expect to lead the team in sacks for the 2nd straight year, did not play, was dealing with an illness. Think he will be back. I would imagine he'll at least travel, and they'll see how he feels on game day on Saturday. But yeah, it was a defensive line coming into this year. They knew they did not have a Jalen Carter. That was no surprise. In the spring, you thought a guy that would probably come along would be Bear Alexander. The day of G-Day, the spring game, he announces about 2 hours before kickoff that I'm going in the transfer portal. He winds up transferring to USC. And the talk throughout the offseason with this defensive line from Kirby Smart and the players as well, it boiled down to quantity over quality. And when I say that, I'm still saying these are 4-star, 5-star guys. These are still really good defensive linemen, but there's not a guy on this defensive line that is going in the first round in April. They don't have a Jalen Carter or a Jordan Davis, but they've got some really talented guys. They got some really experienced guys. Warren Brinson, Zion Logue, Nazir Stackhouse. All of those guys are seniors. They've been around. They've learned behind some of those guys I just mentioned, waited their turn, and they've had their moments. I think the best half of football from this defensive line through 4 games was the second half against South Carolina. Honestly, when they needed it, and you watch the first half of that South Carolina game, and we were talking about this in the last few days, just getting ready for this game. Me and Benjamin Wolk, who works with me there at Dawgs247, we were convinced at halftime of that South Carolina game that Georgia was going to lose that game. It just looked like they could not stop Spencer Rattler, could not get to him, and he picked them apart. And credit to the defensive line in that second half, they really turned it around. Michael Williams, I think he got at least one sack, but he brought a lot of pressure and got to Rattler. Rattler's final stats look nothing like they did even at the end of the third quarter. I mean, they really turned it up, played well. So that's the thing that's interesting to me from a Georgia perspective, looking at this game. Georgia's 4-0. They're still number one in the country. They've passed all the tests so far. But it's funny, Nathan. I still have a ton of questions about this team, and it boils down to the schedule. And I always like pointing out that, had Georgia had it their way, they would have played at Oklahoma in week 2. And I feel like we would have learned a whole lot more. At least we would be sitting here today with a lot more knowledge about this team and what their weaknesses are, what their strengths are. But when you have to keep the competition in mind, that sort of throws things off. You say, well, they did this, but they did it against UAB, or they did this and it came against Ball State. The South Carolina game is the biggest lesson to me, and there were definitely some positives. But when you look specifically at the defensive line, you got to know that there's a lot of questions there, and they need those guys to step up. And if Michael Williams can't play, that should be considered a golden opportunity for Auburn because he's by far their best pass rusher. Talking about defense, Nathan, what has stood out to you about this Auburn defense? I've only gotten to see them in spurts so far this season. Sometimes with game times, you can kind of catch glimpses of other teams. We'll try to do that a little bit with Auburn. Seems like there's some really impressive things on there. The way they force turnovers. I mean, Eugene Asante really, really stands out. What are the strengths of this Auburn defense, and what do you feel like they've got to do to have a successful Saturday against Georgia?
Yeah, so far so good for this unit, and like we mentioned previously, there are a lot more returning pieces, I think, in place on defense than on the offensive side of the ball. But they still had to fill in here and there with transfers. The defensive line is a lot of new guys. You mentioned Eugene Asante there at linebacker. He's basically a new guy. He transferred in from North Carolina last year. Former 4-star recruit, didn't really play at all. And what a revelation he has been. I mean, I would say right now he's the best player on this defense. And if you had told me back in May, yeah, Eugene Asante is going to be the best player on Auburn's defense heading into the Georgia game, I would just be shell shocked. I mean, we ran into an NFL scout when we were in College Station before the game. Shocker, Jason Caldwell knew him, somehow, and so that it's a big. I know it's a big surprise to you, but he had some guys written down, and he was like, I've heard. He was like 9 on defense. Is that a guy? We were like, yes. Keep your eye on that guy. And then he has the fumble return for a touchdown. He also had a play against. He almost stopped Max Johnson from converting a 3rd and 4, coming like 15 yards from across the field. And everyone in the press box just audibly reacted because we didn't know he could actually run that fast. That linebacker spot, they lose Owen Papo, former 5-star recruit, and I don't really think they've fallen off that much. The defensive front 7 has actually been pretty good through a few games. Again, you mentioned competition level. This is the part of the year where we'll continue to find out more about every single team in the SEC. I will say Auburn has played a couple Power 5 games. Cal is not necessarily the stiffest competition in the world, but that was still a tough game for them to go on the road and get a win really late night out on the West Coast. And the defense is absolutely the reason that they won that game. And you covered this team for a couple of years, Jordan. You know that pretty much there were a lot of instances where the defense would fight, but eventually you have to crack because you're on the field so often when the offense isn't producing. That was one of the first instances I have ever seen of this defense not cracking against Cal. They just kept fighting and fighting, and eventually the offense broke through, but we just kind of kept waiting for the dam to break, and it never did. And so that's a credit to Ron Roberts, the first-year defensive coordinator. That's a veteran name. Obviously, he was most recently at Baylor. Creative blitz packages is kind of the name of the game for him. That's actually, unfortunately, that's how Connor Wegman got hurt against Auburn. Looks like he might be out for the season, but that was an example. It was a delayed safety blitz. And obviously it was kind of an awkward hit for him, but it kind of showed what they're capable of doing in terms of getting to the quarterback. They've successfully done that every single game. That's why Carson Beck in his first road start is going to be an interesting spot for me. But yeah, Jordan, through 4 games, I was talking to Zion Puckett, the fifth-year senior safety from Georgia this week, and he said he feels like 85%, 80% execution through 4 games that they've had on defense, and it's a pretty good number. That is a unit that this is not advanced analysis here, but they have to play well for Auburn to have a chance in any of these games. And I'm kind of at the point where I need to see them not do it in order to think that Georgia's going to come in here. This is not, to me, this doesn't look like a 2021 game. I don't think Carson Beck is just going to be able to drop back and do whatever he wants, like Stetson Bennett did in that game. I mean, he had multiple bombs down the field. This Auburn defense played well even against A&M. That final score isn't really indicative. A&M had a big run at the end of the game to get them down to the goal line, and Auburn's guys are like, you can tell they can barely even keep up. I mean, they've been on the field the entire game. That should have been like a 20-13, 20-17 game. And so, again, through 4 games, through a couple Power 5 opponents, this has been a defense that's been really solid. And, I mentioned it there for a second, but that comes back to another big question mark for me in this game. And it's one that we circled even in the offseason. It's like, oh, Georgia doesn't go on the road. Like you mentioned, this is not by design. Oklahoma was going to be a thing, but they don't go on the road until week 5 at Auburn. And Jordan-Hare Stadium is not necessarily a place you want to make your first career start. Now, I don't doubt that Carson Beck is going to have a good game on Saturday because he's obviously done pretty well so far this season. I'm just interested from your perspective, watching him this year, watching his progression, watching how he won the starting quarterback job. A, how has he done through a few games? B, what are your expectations for him on Saturday? And C, what are some areas where, hey, if Auburn does this, they might be able to confuse him a little bit and make him have a rough day?
The dreaded 3-part question there, Nathan.
Hey, keep track of all of those. You must.
I've got it. Carson, I think, has played really well so far. I gave him, I think, when we did our Q&A, a B+. He's done a very good job of distributing the football. I sort of thought we'd come in, and especially some of those early games, you just see him really lock on and throw to like 1 or 2 guys. Done a good job of passing the ball along, getting many different receivers involved. My biggest knock on him so far, he's just missed some deep shots, whether it's just not seeing a guy. He had one overthrow to Jackson Meeks against UAB, and then another throw that probably should have been caught by Arian Smith, but wound up being incomplete. So probably the explosives is the biggest thing. What sticks with me going into this game, because I do think, that the crowd is going to play a role, and that you are going to see times where they're having to really work on communication to make plays and get plays off. But going back even before the start of the season, something Kirby Smart really harped on with Carson is that he's an even kill guy, level headed, never too high, never too low. And you have seen that in the games when you've either watched from the sidelines or even on the telecast, seeing him on the sideline. If something didn't go right, you don't see him getting upset. You don't see him in anybody's face, just kind of cool, calm, and collected. And that will be tested on Saturday. This is definitely going to be the biggest test so far of his career as a starter. Again, only his 5th start, first one on the road. It was really interesting to me. One, we know there's going to be a lot of pressure on him. But Kirby made it a point this week to say, look, he's got to take care of business, but he's got 10 guys around him too that have to help him. And, we had a chance on Wednesday night to talk to Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint, who's been one of the leading receivers this year, Cedric Van Pran, who's a 3rd-year starter at center. And they really broke down the things they can do to help Carson, whether it's just getting aligned, getting ready, being in the right spot at the right time. Cedric making sure everybody's on the right page. I think that they understand that they've got to be ready because this is something new for Carson. When it comes to Carson and when it comes to Auburn playing this game, I think the biggest thing is bringing pressure. And we know Ron Roberts is going to do that. Kirby was very complimentary of Ron and the job he has done when he spoke about him on Monday. But the times that you've seen him make mistakes, he had a turnover on downs against UAB, and it boiled down to pressure. It was 4th and 3. They had an open receiver. Rara Thomas was on a slant. UAB brought 6. The pressure didn't quite get there, but it was coming, and Carson threw behind Rara. And I think that's the thing. And I think it's something that is another point to watch with Carson is how he handles himself in the pocket. There's been a few times where you can see he's a little, got happy feet in the pocket coming up, not being willing to let the play develop and feeling that pressure and letting it affect him. To me, that is going to be the key. If we are sort of looking at the game after the fact and we say Auburn played it close and they did a good job on defense, I would say, well, then they probably got after Carson and they affected his play. Give him a lot of time, he will come up because that South Carolina game, he matched Spencer Rattler throw for throw. And I thought he did a very good job. The South Carolina game by far has been his best start, particularly when you consider the competition. So, yeah, it's going to be something to watch. I think Ron Roberts is going to try to be really creative and try to test a Georgia offensive line that lost its right tackle in that South Carolina game. So they have played well since Amarius Mims got hurt, but you have to keep that in mind that they lost that starter. And, this is going to be a big test for all those guys.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up that situation there for Georgia because they've got a long injury list that I wanted to kind of get into from the Auburn side of things. Just to kind of give Georgia fans an update for the Tigers in terms of their injuries. There are 3 guys that you're not going to see on the field on Saturday. Damari Alston, the running back, it was kind of by committee here early in the season. He looked really good from a 4-star recruit from Atlanta. I can't remember if Georgia recruited him or not, but shoulder injury for him against A&M. He's going to be out for a while, dislocated shoulder. Austin Keys was their starting middle linebacker. Ole Miss transfer. He's out for a while after thumb surgery a couple weeks ago. And then Keontae Scott, you mentioned Ron Roberts, that star position there. That is what they call their nickel back. It's so important. Scott's going to be out for another couple months after a high ankle sprain. And so every other position I would think is going to play. There's little dings and bruises here and there. The health of this secondary, though, is going to be key, and how often these guys can stay on the field is going to be key for a guy like Carson Beck because against A&M, dropping like flies. I mean, DJ James, their number 1 corner, he left the game at one point. Donovan Kaufman, who takes over at star at that nickel spot, he's been a really kind of dynamic, versatile player. He had to leave the game and couldn't come back. Zion Puckett, the starting safety, he had to leave the game and couldn't come back. And so when Max Johnson came in the game for A&M, that's something Hugh Freeze said. He said, look, we had a couple busted coverages, but we had our 3rd team safety in the game. And so the injury bug, particularly in the secondary, has just not been very nice to Auburn here early in the year. But I think numbers-wise, correct me if I'm wrong, it certainly seems that way. I think Georgia has a more extensive list right now. Tell me the names that are on there and which ones you think are most significant right now.
Nathan, I feel like I need one of those ad where they speed up your voice by like 2.5, like they're reading an advertisement to go through. The biggest ones, Lad McConkey, he has not played yet this year, dealing with a back injury. It sounds like they're optimistic, and I believe he will at least travel, and they're going to watch him in warmups and see if he's able to go. But again, he hasn't played at all that this year, which has been a significant loss for Carson Beck. That's probably going to be his number 1 receiver had he been playing. Elsewhere, running back is pretty beat up. Kendall Milton's been dealing with an MCL injury. Sounds optimistic. He's another guy that I do think will travel. Roderick Robinson's a true freshman who kind of picked up the load in those early games because Dejon Edwards, who's the number 1 back, did not play to start the season. But Roderick is dealing with a high ankle sprain. I do not think he's going to make that trip to Auburn. He is still on the recovery and still trying to work his way back. Michael Williams, like I mentioned, at defensive end. I think he will make the trip coming back from an illness. And then probably the other big one, because there's a few reserve guys that are also beat up, banged up, but Javon Bullard at safety. I mean, this is a guy that is pivotal to this defense. He was the star last year for Georgia, was the defensive MVP of both playoff victories. Had started the season really well, got hurt against Ball State, did not play against South Carolina, did not play against UAB. I think they're optimistic. I think he's another guy that they want to see how he warms up because he warmed up for the South Carolina game and they shut it down, said he didn't feel right, didn't feel 100%. So there's definitely question marks. And if you are Auburn, just given what you know about both teams, given the lay of the land, I think you kind of take the setup for this game, playing it in Jordan-Hare, getting a Georgia team that is fairly beat up at this point in the year. Because if some of those guys that I named don't go, it's pretty significant losses for Georgia.
At least, yeah, at least from my perspective of someone who has not watched every snap Georgia has played this season and knowing the impact of some of these injuries, it doesn't seem like the Death Star has completely started firing up yet. I mean, I know that Georgia is a team that is extremely well coached, probably better than anybody in the country. I think their depth, that's the biggest thing. Like the whole recruiting argument, at least, and this is kind of an aside, but you know, everyone knows how important it is for somebody like Georgia and the teams that have been recruiting at a high level over the past few years. When you have injuries like this, and you've mentioned a bunch of ones that really matter, like your number one receiver and your number one pass rusher and starting offensive lineman and really good running back, when these guys are all injured and you're still just kind of humming along and you still are playing your biggest rival on the road and you're like a 16-point favorite, that just goes to show how well you've kind of stocked the cupboard there. And that's something that'll be interesting, from my perspective in this game, is that this is another one where talent gap has been the word Hugh Freeze has used a lot. That's been a buzzword for him really since he got hired, because he's a lot more transparent, I think, than the past couple Auburn coaches in saying, look, like if we execute well, we can compete with anybody, which is the case when you play in the SEC, I think. But he was like, we don't have the talent to consistently beat these teams. Like, if you go play Georgia at home, you might only win 2 times out of 10 because they have that. As he said on last week, he said, look, these next few opponents we're playing, A&M, Georgia, LSU, they have stacked top 5 class on top 5 class on top 5 class. And he made the point. He was like, we're halfway through one class. So really, you kind of have to take that zoomed out perspective. And I think that's something all Auburn fans know, but just kind of offering that to the side of Georgia fans. That is at least where the Auburn head coach is in this situation right now. Now, is the fan expectation the same? You'd like to think so, but patience is, I don't know. I've not necessarily been pleased with the reaction from one loss against Texas A&M. I think maybe a loss to Georgia, or if they go out and play a little bit better, people will realize, hey, we're just not there yet. But I do think this is a game, Jordan, where you look back, and I think earlier this week people thought that that Hugh Freeze was comparing himself to Kirby Smart's early career. He was not doing that. He even said, look, I know what Kirby inherited. I think he meant he knows that he inherited a team that won 20 games over the previous 2 years. But it still needs to be an Auburn team that plays better. And I think that's just at the end of the day here. Now, there are factors for Auburn to go in there and pull an upset. Mainly, it means you play almost a perfect game, and Georgia kind of helps you out a little bit. But they do need to play better, I think is the big thing in this game. They cannot go out there and have the sort of offensive performance that they did against Texas A&M. Even if you put up a similar amount of points, it just looked ugly. It just looked like you didn't necessarily have an identity on that side of the ball. I want to ask really quickly before we maybe move into some keys to the game. You mentioned Georgia's running game. I am interested how successful that has been. And then a couple guys that have been mentioned to us this week by Auburn players. Look, they pointed out the 2 transfer receivers, and then obviously Brock Bowers. Those are, Ra Thomas was a guy that Auburn was extremely interested in the transfer portal. Also, you get Dominic Lovett. They pretty much grabbed 2 of the SEC's best transfer receivers. How have they performed in the passing game? And then is this running game one where you think could set the tone on Saturday? Because Auburn's run defense it's not been incredible, but it's been pretty solid here through a few games.
We talked about the defensive line earlier, and to me, besides the defensive line, it is the run game that I have the biggest questions about, just because I mentioned earlier, they are pretty banged up. Dejon Edwards had missed the first couple games, came back against South Carolina, wound up, no big deal, just rushing for his career best. I think it was something like 108 yards, something like that. And was huge, especially in that fourth quarter. They really rode him hard. If you don't have Kendall Milton, that's a pretty tough loss as far as your 1-2 combo, not having that second guy. Roderick Robinson, still a freshman, still had a ways to go, but it was giving you some pretty valuable carries in those early games. You're kind of looking at guys like Andrew Paul, who's a redshirt freshman, who last fall camp was looking really good and then tore his ACL. And I think they're trying to be very conscious of how they kind of work him back and the workload they give him. I'm really interested to see how much he plays and if he does get a significant number of carries. And it's so wild to me, Nathan. We talk about Georgia and how they've recruited, but they have a few walk-ons that they rely on quite a bit. And I think one we'll see is Cash Jones, one of the running backs, a guy from Texas that they got on late back when he was being recruited. And he's played quite a bit. He's had a couple of touchdowns through these early games. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw him get a few snaps along the way, and he would be pretty big in that. Just being able to move that, and make sure Georgia is not one dimensional. And to mention those receivers, Dom Lovett almost immediately has been one of Carson Beck's leading receivers, one of his go-to guys. Which again, I think in part is probably because Ladd has not been playing, but when he got here in the spring, he was getting buzz immediately. I mean, to the point that, I felt like he had a chance to be an all SEC receiver. And I think he still does have a chance. He's caught several passes to this point in the year. Got to be a little more consistent. He's had some drops where someone in the press box during one game pointed out he makes all the hard catches. It's usually those easy catches that I don't know if it's thinking about, yards after the catch or what. But again, some of those games, maybe that had something to do with it. Ra Thomas, I think, has come a long way. They talked about early in the year, he didn't play quite that much in those early weeks. And they talked about he was trying to get caught up with the playbook, sort of learning, because imagine coming from Mike Leach's air raid and coming to this offense, very, very different. And you're definitely asking a whole lot of different things from those receivers. But Rara's probably been their most consistent deep threat. And going back to that South Carolina game, because again, that by far has been the most telling game that Georgia's had. I think it might have been the first or second play of the third quarter. Georgia's down 14-3, really can't afford to not score points on this drive. Carson Beck throws it to Ra Thomas. It's about a 35-yard gain, and you could kind of feel, especially with that being a home game, Sanford Stadium get a little energy, a little bit of confidence, and really from there on, Georgia just dominated. So I expect healthy doses of Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas. And again, like I talked about, that run game is going to be very, very interesting and something to watch. Nathan, I'm going to throw us to a break real quick. We'll come back and really dive into specifics of Saturday's game, what we're looking for, what needs to happen for both sides to be successful, and give some score predictions. Welcome back, everybody. Well, Nathan, looking to Saturday, let's start with where this line is. I think it's a little bit north of 2 touchdowns. Did this catch you off guard? And what do you make of where this line is and Vegas's expectations for how this game plays out?
We were sitting in the Houston airport, George Bush, and made predictions about 30 minutes before this came out on where it was going to be. And yeah, it is it's sort of surprising when, I mean, maybe not surprising based on this year, but it's not what you want to see when you're Auburn, when you're kind of just throwing out that it's easily going to be a 2 touchdown spread. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think that Auburn's defense can keep Georgia from scoring too much. And at the risk of sounding like extremely rudimentary here, I think it just comes down to how many touchdowns Auburn can score in this game. If they, and again, this is extremely baseline analysis here, but if they can score, if Auburn can score more than 1 touchdown in this game, I think they have a good chance of covering. Because then you're asking Georgia to get into the 30s. If Auburn puts up 17, you're asking Georgia to get like 30, 34, 35 points plus to cover in this game. Can they do that in Jordan-Hare? I mean, they can. Absolutely they can. But again, I haven't seen Auburn's defense break down that much this year. They've executed for the most part on all 3 levels pretty well. And I do think they'll be looking to take advantage of Georgia playing at one of its biggest rivals, playing in an extremely difficult place to play in the first road game of the season and the first road game for Carson Beck. So as I'm sure we'll get into a couple times here in our keys to the game, so much of this comes down to Auburn's passing game. It's they can hang around for a little bit, and it's funny, they hung around until the fourth quarter. If Robbie Ashford hits a touchdown throw that was pretty much on the money to Shane Hooks, and he's had some issues, not with drops, but just not making catches in coverage. If he catches that ball, it's 20-17 with 7 minutes left after Auburn has played just horrendously on offense the entire game. And so they could be in that situation for a couple quarters against Georgia, but if it doesn't get going, I don't see it being a 3-point game in the fourth quarter. I think Georgia obviously has much more talent on both lines of scrimmage to be able to kind of put the game away and start to wear down Auburn. And so, yeah, when it comes to the line specifically, again, I think it's pretty cut and dry. If Auburn scores 2 touchdowns in this game, I think they have a pretty good chance of covering. If not, I mean, you can see Georgia maybe get around to the low 30s. If Auburn can't get past 10 points, then Georgia will probably cover in that regard.
I think you hit on it. I mean, I think this line is representative of the confidence in Auburn's offense or lack thereof. I mean, and you were there, so you have a much better perspective. But Georgia, that game against UAB didn't kick off till 7:30 Eastern, so I was like, okay, I'm gonna plant down and watch this. And by about the third quarter, I'd kind of seen enough with the Auburn offense. A lot of questions they have got to figure out. Whether it's Peyton Thorne or who they decide to trot out there, they've got to be more productive in the passing game. And I will say, too, I think you made a good point about the defense. The fact that they didn't kind of, throw it in and call it a day on the road in College Station in that game, that tells me that it would take a whole lot of points from Georgia for that to happen in Jordan-Hare, where that stadium's going to be loud, where you've got that crowd support. So I do think that's something to keep in mind. Well, looking at this game, Nathan, what has to go right for Auburn? In your mind, if we say at the end of Saturday, this was a competitive game for Auburn, Auburn made it a 4-quarter contest, what had to go right? What does Auburn need to do to hang with Georgia?
Yeah, it starts and ends, maybe not ends, but it definitely starts with Peyton Thorne in that passing game. And at the risk of repeating the same things a few times during this show, like you said, Jordan, anybody watching that game against Texas A&M knows that if they have a little bit more juice on offense in that game, not even on offense, they actually ran the ball pretty well. And I haven't even talked about Auburn's running backs. I feel like they can be pretty good. They can be pretty good this season. Even without Damari Alston, you've got Jarquez Hunter that Georgia fans remember, from the past couple years. He's been pretty good. Brian Battie is a USF transfer who ran for 1,000 yards last year. He's been pretty solid. And Jeremiah Cobb is a 4-star guy that Georgia recruited, Clemson recruited, Tennessee recruited. He's been really, really good too. He definitely looks the part of a future SEC running back. But the problem is, Texas A&M came out. They were like, all right, go ahead and throw it because we don't think you can do it. Auburn couldn't do it. And so after they learned Auburn couldn't do it, they just stacked the box. You couldn't run it anymore. And that's when the 4 straight 3-and-outs came. And so, that was something that Hugh Freeze said on the teleconference yesterday. One of the things he's most impressed about Georgia's defense over the years from, hey, you played Kirby all the way back in 2016 in his first year to now. He said, look, they do the same things on defense, same sort of principles. It's just so much more difficult to predict. And he's talking about not only heading into a game, but drive to drive. They do such a good job of disguising things. And again, it's really going to take Peyton Thorne being on the money in this game. I'm not thinking he has to be an explosive passer by any means. And I am, again, saying this assuming that he is their starting quarterback. I think he's going to be. Would not be surprised to see him get pulled if nothing works, just because Robbie Ashford's so different. Like, Robbie Ashford's a guy, he's not going to get sacked, at least not very easily. He's a guy who can slip out of the pocket, keep plays alive for better or for worse. Thorne is not as athletic. Thorne's pocket presence maybe isn't as good, so he's just going to get taken down if there's pressure. It also goes over to the turnover side of things, which is always a key when you're looking for an upset. I mean, it's pretty much key in any game. But Auburn is one of the only teams in the country right now. So they've forced 8 turnovers on the season, but their margin is only +1. And so I think they're one of only 4 teams in college football right now with that low of a margin, but that many turnovers forced. That goes back to the defense has done a good job. I mean, you saw the turnover against A&M. Eugene Asante had to juke out Jimbo Fisher, but they've also had 5 interceptions on the season. And so you're talking about a pretty opportunistic defense. A bunch of guys in that secondary have been getting involved. Jalen Simpson is a name. He's a Georgia kid who's going to be fired up. It's definitely his last game. He's going to the NFL. Playmaker there at safety, moved from corner to safety. He's awesome. I mean, he's just a ball hawk. He had 3 picks through the first 3 games of the year. Didn't have one against A&M, but he's definitely a guy when that ball's in the air. He'll be looking for it. And so it's kind of simple when you're talking about the recipe for an upset, but winning the turnover battle. If Peyton Thorne completes decent amount of his passes, he goes for over 100 yards. By the way, Auburn hasn't thrown for 100 yards in a Power 5 game since like last October. So that's not necessarily great. And this is not Navy we're talking about. This is Auburn that now has a passing oriented head coach. So they definitely like to see that get fixed. But if you're talking about Auburn winning the turnover margin and Peyton Thorne hits on a few good throws, doesn't turn it over, I definitely think Auburn's in this game in the fourth quarter. I still don't think they'll win, but that's you're talking about the recipe for them to be competitive in this game. I think those are the 2 biggest things because I do think the defense will do a good job. Now, if the defense doesn't do a good job, Carson Beck does whatever he wants. Running game goes wild for Georgia. I mean, this won't be competitive. I am interested from your perspective, though, talking about what is sort of Georgia's mindset and the keys that they're looking at in this game. I know that South Carolina has been pretty much the only data piece for them against quality opposition. But as you know from covering the sport for a long time, like you can take things away from Ball State and you can take things away from UAB, similar to how like Auburn's playing UMass in season opener. And I'm like, this passing game might have some issues. Like they score 50 plus points. And I'm like, there's some things going on here. You can sort of read and figure it out. What are some spots that you think, okay, Georgia has done this really well. They need to keep doing this. Or, hey, this is something they need to fix and could be an issue for them and maybe a formula for Auburn to keep this thing close.
Well, to date, they've done a very good job of taking care of the football. Off the top of my head, I think they've only had 2 turnovers so far. One was a bobbled pass that was intercepted against Ball State, and then they had a fumble against UAB on a punt return. So for the most part, taking care of the ball. And I think that Auburn's got to get Auburn to make this competitive has to win the turnover battle. I think it's as simple as that. Something that I think that they are really going to be mindful of in this game is trying to create explosive plays. And we've heard a good bit about it from Kirby Smart the last couple of weeks. He brought up a fact that some of the numbers they have, we put so much value in that turnover ratio. He said that, that they have the stats that show that the teams that create more explosive plays on a given Saturday, that the win-loss percentage is considerably higher compared to who wins a turnover battle. And I think that's something Georgia wants. As I mentioned earlier, Carson's had some opportunities. They've made a few come through with some big plays through the air, but there's been missed opportunities. And when you look at this game, I see, Mike Bobo. Hey, I know a lot of Auburn fans remember that name. I think he'll come into this game and understand that a good way to kind of quiet that crowd is to take a shot fairly early. And I think that will also help kind of settle Carson in. I think he's a guy with a big arm that likes to really make a couple big throws before he's finally really comfortable and really able to operate. So I'm expecting on that first or second drive for Georgia them to take a deep shot with either Rara Thomas, who we talked about, Arian Smith, the guy that had the 76-yard touchdown in the Peach Bowl against Ohio State. That I don't think if they don't get that play, I don't think Georgia wins that game. I mean, a huge momentum change in that game. So I expect that being really, really big for Georgia to try to create explosive plays early. And then the other thing is just really relying on the run game with Dejon Edwards. I think that as good as I do think this passing game is, they've got to show that they can consistently run the ball. They did a very good job against South Carolina, but I mean, at times they've been playing with spare parts at running back. They've been playing Dylan Bell, who's a wide receiver. He's taken several carries and been in the backfield. If you see number 86 on Saturday, you don't need to adjust your TV. That is a receiver taking snaps back there at running back. But those are the big things to me that I think if they take care of the ball, if they're able to run it, and if they take some shots early, it'll set up Georgia to have a really successful day. I'll throw it to you, Nathan, and then I will follow up. How do you see this playing out? What's your prediction for this game? How do you see this edition of the Deep South's oldest rivalry playing out?
Yeah, it still takes some getting used to, by the way, of playing this at this point in the year. I think I'll be used to it after a couple more years, but I think for Auburn, you're maybe glad that it is where it is because, like we mentioned previously, this might be a good spot to catch Georgia in terms of health, but also when you're going against some of the better coach teams in the country, you even look at somebody like Alabama, like they look better than they did against USF and Texas. They look better against Ole Miss. Georgia's probably in that same camp where they're going to improve over the course of the year because you have so much talent and so much coaching. There is a key to this game that I am interested that could sway. Again, I'm not convinced that there's a lot of avenues for Auburn to win this game, but could sway the competitiveness. And it goes with actually a comment that we've got on your YouTube page right now, and that's that Georgia needs to be more productive in the first half of the game. Looking at just kind of jumping over some scores early this year, I have seen that hey, they've let some other teams hang around because maybe they haven't scored too much. Auburn hasn't scored in the first quarter since week 1. So that could be something. And again, I think that's kind of an overblown piece sometimes in games. People say, "Oh, you got to get off to a hot start." That's always a great question. Coach, how important is it to get off to a fast start? But at the same time, those points will come back later in the game to end up mattering. And so that is something I'll be interested in. You kind of have seen Auburn over the years take advantage of a hot crowd in the middle of the day at a 2:30 kick and really kind of ride that wave, maybe get an early touchdown. That could be a key in this game. If they hadn't looked so out of sorts in the passing game against Texas A&M and against another really good defensive line, which A&M's D line right now might be better than Georgia's, but they were so out of whack in that game. I'm not sure you can make changes along the offensive line. I'm not sure you can make changes in game plan. I'm not sure you can make changes in confidence level for a guy like Peyton Thorne from one week to another coming home against the number 1 team in the country to be able to have a chance to win this game. Now, I'm still giving the staff the benefit of the doubt because you've seen Hugh Freeze in this movie before. Like they do well in upset scenarios when they play at home. Look back at his time at Ole Miss. They weren't supposed to beat a couple teams when he was at Liberty. Like he gets his teams up for these games, and normally their game plans are pretty effective. And so I'm still thinking that they have a chance to play better here on Saturday. It all comes down to that for me. It all comes down to the passing game. It all comes down to the offensive line and Peyton Thorne. And I just don't see them having the horses right now. We haven't even mentioned the receivers for Auburn, where they've got a couple guys who have done well, but that's it. I mean, it's just not a very deep receiving core where they've had a lot of explosiveness. But at the same time, they haven't really had an opportunity to because the quarterbacks haven't been able to complete the ball. And so I think maybe, hey, if this is Ole Miss coming into Jordan-Hare, then maybe that's a better bounce back spot. And you're saying, hey, if we execute and we have a better game plan, and we coach our quarterbacks better. That's what Hugh Freeze said this week. He said, look, we let them down. Like we let Peyton Thorne down. We did not coach him well enough. It's not something I think you would have heard the previous coach say, but maybe if it wasn't number 1 Georgia looking to three-peat, you would maybe have a better spot to bounce back here. I just think this is the wrong timing. It's the wrong spot for Auburn. Georgia, I think, will get better as the year has gone along, and I think there's just way too much talent on this Georgia defense. At the risk of 2 games going back-to-back with the same score, I think I'm going to pick Georgia 27-10, which is the same score as A&M. That would be 3 Georgia touchdowns and a couple field goals. That seems right to me, and it goes back to where I think that would cover at a lot of places because I don't think it's up to 17 everywhere. But it goes back to what we were talking about before. If Auburn scores and it's 27-17, then they would cover in that instance. And so could be more than that, give or take a touchdown here or there, but that just feels right for me right now, with the caveat of, if you're an Auburn fan, with the caveat of saying, if you play well and you improve from last week, this will be a good game. If you are going to Jordan-Hare, you're going to have a good time. This will probably be a competitive game. I don't see Georgia going in there and blowing the doors off of this defense with the way they've played early in the year. And so I wonder how similar your prediction is, Jordan, from the Georgia side of things.
Pretty much exactly what you had. You had 27-10. I had 28-10. One point I did want to bring up that I hadn't mentioned that I think is something to keep in mind for this Auburn offense. The last 2 games, South Carolina and UAB, Georgia's defense has allowed a 2-minute drill touchdown right before the end of the first half. And, we talk so much about the middle 8, and we talk about trying to make the most of possessions, which I don't know, Nathan, if you have the same feeling. It just feels like with the clock changes that maybe you don't have quite as many possessions, maybe by just one or two, but it seems like those first halves go by so fast. And if you, one, miss on opportunities, but two, cash in like right before a half, that it's huge. And I would say that that's something that I would watch with Auburn, see if they're able to score right before the break, especially if they were to get the ball to start the third quarter. Again, it all boils down to me with Auburn's quarterback. If Auburn was getting good quarterback play and their passing offense looked dangerous, I would say that this would be a 4-quarter game that they could keep up with Georgia. I think I would still probably pick Georgia just because of the talent and just because of what they've got on both sides of the ball. But I just say I have to see it to believe it. I just there was not enough there from Peyton Thorne. I will say Kirby Smart's super complimentary of Robbie Ashford and what he brings to the table and understanding what kind of threat he is. And he said good things about Peyton Thorne as well. But I just don't think Auburn's going to be able to move the ball enough. I think that it would probably take a defensive touchdown for this to be a 4-quarter game. I'm just not sure that they can muster the offense against a defense that, admittedly has some holes and has some things it's still figuring out after losing the guys it did last year. But I'm going 28-10, and I wanted to make sure I mention Benjamin Wolk, our buddy. He is picking 30-14 Georgia to win, so that's probably a push depending on where you've got that line. But I'm saying 28-10. I just do not see an avenue where Auburn gets enough offense to win this one.
Yeah, and crazier things have certainly happened inside that stadium, and this will tell me a lot. This I think, and we say it every week, or at least we have here when you're talking about a year one coaching staff. You're going to learn more every single game because I think it's so clear right now that it's hard to know who you have when you haven't played games. Like even in the preseason, this was a patchwork offensive line that I think in terms of pass pro, like they thought they were going to be better than they have been through a few games. Peyton Thorne, he won this job because of his decision making and because of how comfortable he looked running this offense. Neither of those things have been very good through a few games. And so it really just goes to show sometimes it doesn't even matter the competition level. Sometimes you just have to see the bullets start flying. And that's why I think, depending on what happens here, Robbie Ashford could be a better solution for them after the bye week. Again, I'm kind of jumping the gun here. One game, Peyton Thorne could go out and have a much improved performance. But again, this has the opportunity, I think, to be a competitive game in spots because of where it's being played. If it was in Sanford Stadium, I don't think I would necessarily share that same opinion. You've seen Auburn on the road over the years on offense. It's not a very pretty picture sometimes when they play great defenses, but when they come home, obviously they've got a little bit more juice. And so, I'm glad you brought up that early part of the game as well, and that middle eight and kind of the clock kind of playing a factor. You really have to kind of get into the nitty gritty to see what the clock has done. I think people are like, oh, it's shortening games. It's not really shortening games that much. It's just you look at total plays, and sometimes if you have a bunch of penalties or you have a bunch of turnovers, all of a sudden, like you've only had 3 drives in the first half, just because of how quickly it can turn over. That was Auburn's case against Cal. Like they weren't playing awful on offense, but they were turning it over and they had penalties. All of a sudden, like it's fourth quarter, it's go time. Like you have to win this game. You just haven't had the ball that much. And so ball control for Auburn on offense with the running backs, I think could be a key in here as well. Like you, I'm obviously hoping this is another exciting edition of this rivalry. We've had a bunch of them over the years, but man, this is a streak Auburn would like to break sooner rather than later. I don't know if this is the year to do it and they go to Athens next year, but 6 straight losses for Auburn going back since that 2017 SEC championship game. It ties their second worst streak in the series history. And so I know Georgia is where they are, Jordan, but from being on both sides of this rivalry, how badly Auburn fans want Hugh Freeze to crack this thing at some point.
Definitely. And it's hard to believe, honestly, that it's been so long since Auburn won that game. And, we'll be having this conversation next year where Auburn wants to win in Georgia for the first time, win in Athens for the first time since 2005, which is hard to believe. But it's going to make for a good game. I think it's going to make for a fun game, going to be another interesting edition of this game. Nathan, before we get out of here, any parting thoughts, anything else that's on your mind about this game and what we're getting ready to walk into in Jordan-Hare on Saturday?
Yeah, from a micro perspective on Auburn, week to week this team is so interesting because I don't think that they have or that anybody should necessarily from the outside have these super lofty goals for them this season, but winning 7 games would be pretty good for Hugh Freeze in year one. And so really just for me, it's kind of saying, hey, what does their path look like every single week? I think the bye week really comes at the right time for them. So that's something I'll be interested in saying. I'm not saying they have no chance to win this game, but assuming that they do lose this game, I'm going to be looking for trends going into the bye week. We mentioned play calling, we mentioned quarterback play. Those are kind of the 1A and 1B here. That maybe there could be some changes because Hugh Freeze, talking to him on Monday, he's not attached to much of anything. And even we're talking about Holden Garner, the third team quarterback we haven't even mentioned. He didn't sound too opposed to like giving him a shot at some point. And so he's got nothing to lose. From a zoomed out perspective, getting to see a playoff contender come in, a team that's trying to make a historic three-peat in Georgia. I remember Kirby coming to that Birmingham fundraiser, a few months ago, and I was there, and somebody asked him about three-peating. What's your mindset of trying to three-peat? And he said, same it's been with the other two. I thought that was such a great answer. And so, Georgia over the course of this year is such an interesting team to watch. But it seems like, Jordan, I know that you've seen it here in the early stages of the year. Like, we've got some parity going on at the top of the sport. I don't know if anyone is necessarily like excellent at this point, and that's really fun from a fan perspective. Can Georgia become that team? Maybe it could start with a blowout win on Saturday. They really start to crack their knuckles, but I think we're going to get through most of the season with a bunch of really, really good, maybe not great teams. So I'll be interested to get eyes on Georgia. It's one of a couple teams of that regard that Auburn will play this season, and see what they look like on Saturday, and then maybe see what they look like in November.
Definitely, and it's almost a shame that this year is playing out where I wish that we had that 12-team playoff this year because I think it could get really, really feisty and see those teams make it interesting. Really, I think I've hit on most of the things for me. Again, want to see Georgia's defensive line, want to see how well they run the ball, and want to see how Carson Beck reacts to this crowd because it's going to be like nothing he's ever played in before. And if Georgia makes plays early, then that crowd probably won't matter as much in that second half. Nathan, I think we're going to wrap it up right there. I appreciate you for popping on. Obviously, go check out the Auburn Undercover podcast and everybody over there at Auburn-247. All kinds of good content as we get ready for this game. Of course, go to Dawgs247. We got you covered for all the Georgia coverage, the Junkyard Dogcast. Also, go to our YouTube, Dawgs247. Got all kinds of content over there, from the podcast to Kirby Smart press conferences to our interviews with the players. Lots of good stuff there. So we're going to wrap it up right there. For Nathan King, I am Jordan Hill. And until next time, take care, everybody.